Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to another episode of Thursday's Theology, and thank you for joining us for this series that we've entitled Should They? And in the series, we've talked about different topics about whether or not Christians should do that. So last week, we talked about should Christians be involved with politics? And this week, I'm actually really excited for a couple different reasons. One, we're going to be talking about should Christians swear? And so I'm really excited about that. But the other reason I'm really excited is one, I am recording this episode in the youth room that I grew up in Oakland. I'm visiting some family for the weekend, and I'm really excited to be able to come back to where it all started for me and record there. But the other reason I'm really excited is that we finally have the man, the myth, the legend, the guy behind the curtain. My good friend and producer Tom is here joining us this week to talk about swearing. So welcome, Tom, to Thursday's Theology.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So as we were talking about this series and should Christians swear, it just brought up a lot of memories from just being with you when you were a youth and some of the poor choices I made and stuff like that. So let me ask you to start off with, what has been your experience with swearing?
Yeah, my experience with swearing has been very Christian. When I was younger, when I was in middle school, I made a specific effort to try not to swear because I thought it was bad and that I thought it would make me and the church look bad. And that was until around high school when I started realizing, like, it's not a bad thing. Like, just because you swear doesn't mean you're a bad person. And I think that's really interesting.
Yeah, and I have to admit to our viewers that I was your youth leader throughout your youth, and I remember we took a summer trip one time to Visalia, California, the middle of nowhere in the Central Valley, and I remember, I forget if I was frustrated or if I was excited or something, but I swore in front of you, and I looked back in the rearview mirror, and you just had this look of utter betrayal in your eyes. It was a moment where it was like, oh man, I went too far.
Yeah, it must be noted we did create a safe space where everyone, when we were in the car, everything was we could be comfortable with each other, and nothing that we said left the car,
Sure.
And we could kind of vent, and I think that's very important. But yeah, there were a lot of funny interactions in that car ride.
Yeah, Tom saw a side of me that I'm not sure I was ready to show him. But anyway, that being said, so today we're going to talk about should Christians swear, and you've heard a little bit about both of our stories with that. But Tom actually had some really good points in our conversation about it, and I wanted to ask you, what is one of those points? Let's start with point number one that you brought up.
Yeah, so I brought up that in American culture, swearing or cursing is very much like an integral part of conversation. It is used a lot of the times in showing how passionate or how extremely you feel about something.
Mm-hmm.
So if you say that you're pretty mad, like that's like you can tell that someone's mad. But if they start cursing up a storm, you can tell, like, oh man, this person's like really serious. Like they're feeling strong emotions that they really can't even hold in. And I think it's important to remember that, like, swearing is a good way to show how strongly you feel about something when used properly. And that does bring me to my next point, is that a lot of the time swearing can be used for aggressive messages and for trying to harm other people, which is not the correct use as we Christians can be using them.
Yeah, and I think that's a great point, because I think I would venture to say the majority of times somebody swears at you, they probably aren't doing so for good reason, or they're not doing so to say, like, oh, I'm really passionate about what I'm thinking, and I want to show you you're wrong. Like, I don't think that's the case. I think it's more they intend harm, or they intend to belittle you or whatever. So I think what you're touching on is interesting, because swearing is a part of our vocabulary. It just is. You're not going to go very far to hear somebody swear or use a curse word, right? So I think you touch on an important point, and theologically speaking, it's taking swearing and almost redeeming it, I guess, in a way, because basically as Christians, I think I agree with you. I think there are proper times and places to swear and to use curse words, but I think it's about understanding the proper context and using it for good purposes or for righteous purposes.
Yeah.
So, um, so yeah. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
Oh no, that's fine. Yeah. So malintent is not, at least as Christians use swearing, is not. At least it's not productive.
Mm-hmm.
You're not spreading the kingdom and not bettering the kingdom by swearing and cursing down people.
And I think too that something you talked about in your story about growing up, about how it would represent you in the church badly. I do think that is true to a certain extent, because again, proper place and context for using swear words. But I've always been a big believer that people's perception of who you are and who Christ is based on how you act and what you say. So if you're constantly swearing, like if you stub your toe and you shout off expletives, or if you cut somebody off or they cut you off and you call them less than choice words, then people are going to notice, like, oh, that's how you talk. That's normally how what you say. So I think that goes back to our point about redeeming swearing, because if swear words are every third word in our vocabulary, then I think people are going to be very turned off to the gospel or turned off to the church. So I think there is an aspect that the words we use do represent ourselves. So again, understanding the proper place and time and context for using swear words.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think one thing to note is that, at least growing up, would never, like, I would be caught off guard if I heard anyone swearing within the church or like at service, or like even in between services. Like, that definitely feels like a more sacred place, and that is important because that's not the place for it. Like, at least growing up, me being from the younger generation, it's a lot more loose in conversation that swear words can come up and that you can say, more relaxed things.
Yeah.
But being in a place where there's all of the generations have come together to kind of be respectful, that's a very different place, and that, it should be noted, is not where swearing is a good place.
That's a really interesting point. I hadn't thought about that, because I think there is something to be said about, I've been in youth ministry. I realized, by the way, this is a side note, but I realized the other day that this is my 10th year in youth ministry. So yeah, I'm getting up there in years. But I don't think I've ever been part of a youth group where I have not heard swearing on a semi-regular basis. And whether it's a student, my favorite reaction all the time is students who like are talking amongst themselves and one of them swears and they realize I'm within earshot and they freeze and they look like deer in headlight. but then I assure them, I'm like, I went to public school. I've heard worse than that.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think going back to your point, I think that when we are part of the larger church body, we have to understand that the way we speak to one another also is reflective of the church. So if youth are in the back of the sanctuary, cursing up a storm while the sermon's going on, that doesn't really reflect too well on the church itself. One of the most powerful things. Well, let me back up. Whenever a preacher uses a swear word in their sermons, I am always very, very leery of it. Just because, again, that's kind of a sacred space. You're dealing with the Word of God and that sort of thing. But that's not to say it can't be used, right? And the example I'm going to give is one of the more powerful examples that I've heard of that is, I heard a sermon one time where the pastor basically said, growing up in kind of a conservative household, I had this perception of swearing as like, oh, it's evil, it's not good, you should never do it, and stuff like that. But as I've been growing older, I've understood and I've realized that there are certain things in our world that we need to be able to say, no, God, damn that to hell. God, damn this child slavery to hell. Damn this prostitution to hell. So there's a whole spectrum of evil in the world that we need to ask God to subject to eternal damnation.
Yeah.
You know, so I think that there's, if it has a theological reason and it's not just to, like, I'm the youth pastor, I'm going to drop a swear word in my sermon. Like, if it has a theological point, I think it's a valid point to be made.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, definitely.
Of course, as with a lot of our episodes of Thursday's Theology, the conversation can't be contained to just a 10 to 20, 10 to 12 minute episode. So what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and extend this conversation in a podcast, and we'll link to that below. But we're going to keep talking about it. We're going to talk about some of the biblical examples of swearing and cursing. Tom has a really, really good point about how we have equated swearing and cursing as the same thing, but biblically speaking, it's not. So we're going to talk about that in the podcast episode. But what I think we want you to hear from this episode is that the answer to should Christians swear, the answer is yes and no. Yes, because we need to be able to call out evil and be able to show how passionate we are about calling out that evil, and so we have to understand the place and time and context that is required of us. And no, because the words we use are very representative of not only who we are, but who Jesus is. So if somebody sees us swearing and that's all they hear from us, and they know that we're a Christian, their perception of Jesus is like not going to be very high because of the words we choose to use. So should Christians swear? Yes and no. It has its proper place and context, but only in that proper place and context is it should it be used. So if you're using swear words to just kind of fill your vocabulary, I think you're being lazy. There's a whole plethora, you like that plethora of other words that you can use. There's a literal cornucopia of phrases that you can use other than swear words. So anyway, we're gonna continue our conversation in the podcast. So that'll do it for this week's episode of Thursday's Theology. Thanks for joining us. My name is Jeff. I'm your host. And remember, theology doesn't always have to be difficult. It is simply the study of who God is. Take care. We'll see you next week.